Okay. I do believe with that we should be live. Let me just make sure. I do believe that we should be live. Let me just make sure that we are. Okay, cool. All right, so we are live on YouTube right now. Let me make sure I have this link sent out to everybody. Give me a link. That way. All right, and let's make sure that we get this link out to everybody. I apologize for the delay here. Technical difficulties. Okay, and with that, we have the link out to everybody. We should be good. All right, so apologies to everybody for all the technical delays and everything. Just happens like this sometimes. Technology is not perfect. We've had issues with this before sometimes. That's just how it goes. I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick introduction real quick, Dr. Thornton, and then you'll have the floor. That sounds good.
Great.
All right, so Dr. Thornton here is a senior fellow of the Mises Institute. He is also a research fellow of the Independent Institute as well, and author of The Skyscraper Curse, which is a fantastic book I recommend that everybody read. So with that being said, Dr. Thornton, you have the floor.
Hey, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everybody for hanging tough with us through the technical difficulties. I'm sure that is almost entirely my fault, being an ancient technophobe of some degree or another. Um, but I'm really appreciative to be here with you today and to have you guys in the audience. Um, Inflation, money, and the state is a core topic for me in my life, really. As a young man, as a young boy, and on up to this time, it's only gotten more important, and it's going to continue to be more important over time. We're experiencing right now the biggest inflation in 40 years in terms of price inflation, not monetary inflation, but price inflation is the one that we all experience, that we all feel. And, the monetary inflation by the Fed is something that just goes on and nobody cares, essentially. But I think we should care. I'm going to be talking a little bit about predictions. But most of my talk is actually going to be about the recession of 2020. And a lot of people say, well,
Dr. Thornton, I'm going to have to interrupt you here real quick. Apparently, we're getting a little bit of echo on your end from the audio that's feeding back through the live stream. Do you have some headphones that you could use real quick?
No.
Okay. It should be all right. Everyone's just going to have to deal with a little bit of echo then. All right, go ahead and continue. Apologies for the interruption.
No problem. So, as I said, I'm going to be talking mostly about the so-called recession of 2020. But the reason that I'm going to be speaking to you about that so-called recession that never has been spoken about, really, is for the next coming economic crisis. And I think that the wheels are already turning on that economic crisis. It's just barely showing up in some statistics, but it's also showing up in the news. I think most people probably saw that Amazon just announced that it was laying off like 15,000 workers. And there have been several other announcements of layoffs in the economy, mostly tech firms, mostly from companies that were serving us during the lockdown, the COVID lockdowns. And then, of course, if you're highly invested with your retirement money in the stock market or the bond market in the US, the two largest financial markets in the world, by far, you've already felt some of the pain associated with the Fed and rising of interest rates. But I think we're going to have another crisis coming. I think it's short. It's not going to take all that long to materialize, historically speaking. I think it could be incredibly painful, both here in the United States and around the world. And I think when the Fed starts to reveal its response to that crisis, one of the main arguments is going to be, well, when we had COVID and the world had to lock down or die, and the response from the Fed was trillions of dollars of virtually unlimited money, a open checkbook for the Treasury, and for financial markets, certainly zero interest rates, and all the rest, returning to, lifting financial markets and mortgage markets and all the rest. They're going to point out, well, we saved the world by this outrageous, monstrous, historic response on the part of the Fed. So they're going to justify their past actions in terms of COVID, and then that's going to open the floodgates for them responding to this next economic crisis. So I'm not talking about history here, although I think that this particular topic, in terms of how fake that recession was in 2020, has not been discussed. It's something you might not really hear about directly. So many Austrian economists started suspecting a recession was in the works in 2019. I certainly did. Bob Murphy certainly did. The economists of the Mises Institute certainly did. I'm going to be talking about a small book that the Mises Institute published called Anatomy of a Crash, the Financial Crisis of 2020. But most of that book was written in 2019, and some of the articles were even earlier. Only the introductory material was actually written after COVID was announced and after the massive programs were introduced. So Austrians were already suspecting an economic crisis was coming. The expansion had lasted incredibly long. The Fed was very active. Interest rates were abnormally low. The Fed had promised to buy back all of the government bonds and all of the mortgage-backed securities that they had accumulated in yet the previous economic crisis, and they barely had started selling some of that stuff back, that toxic stuff back into the market, when the 2020 recessionary problems started to emerge, and they brought that program to a stop. So it's not terribly unrealistic that people were expecting a real recession, and a real powerful recession in 2020. And you got to think that certainly many people at the Fed were also suspecting such a crisis, or at least a recession, in that year. And in fact, statistically, we got a recession. In this recession, the COVID recession, the COVID lockdowns, justified weapons of monetary destruction on their part and the part of the Treasury Department. In my thinking, all of this was basically simply the Fed having a great excuse to revive and to expand the bubble that they started to inflate after the housing bubble, after the housing crash and the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. And I'm just sitting here, when I was waiting to come on stage, I was sitting here thinking to myself, well, what's going to bail out the Fed this next time? Is it going to be, one of the likely possibilities is war. And so, if nuclear weapons start to go off, that would provide, of course, the obvious entree for the Fed to go ballistic, no pun intended, on the money supply and interest rates, and buying up government-oriented assets to revive that bubble, essentially. So this is all, of course, partially speculative. And Austrian economics teaches us that prediction is really an art. It's not a science. And this comes to you from the guy who teaches the lecture at Mises University on prediction. In my recent book, which Rich kindly mentioned, The Skyscraper Curse, and how Austrian economists predicted every economic crisis over the previous century. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and prediction is, of course, the holy grail, at least for economists and virtually everybody else. So Austrian economists make predictions, and they make mistakes. I make them all the time, but with reason. We can't know the timing and magnitude of an economic crisis or an economic event or trend. Excuse me. I can't tell you exactly when the recession is going to begin, or how bad the economic crisis is going to be, or what the unemployment rate is going to bottom out at. But we can make some predictions based on economic theory. And sometimes these go wrong, and sometimes they need clarification. For example, many of you probably heard that Bob Murphy made a famous prediction of 10% inflation that didn't come true, strictly speaking. And I even wrote an article defending Bob against Paul Krugman and others. Because we did get more than 10% inflation in terms of stock prices, bond prices, land prices, real estate prices. It just didn't show up in consumer prices. So one of the problems with Austrian economics is that there are a lot of qualifiers that we don't get an opportunity to introduce when we're speaking to the general public. Of course, Peter Schiff has made some incredibly great predictions in popular media, but he's also made plenty of mistakes as well. It's just the nature of the game. But if you study it in terms of economic theory, and you understand all the qualifications that are involved in predictions, it's a very worthwhile project. So this recession of 2020, let's just take a step back for a couple of minutes and look at what actually went on and to see how narrow it actually was. First of all, it was the shortest recession or contraction on record. And there's been some pretty short ones, but this is by far the shortest one on record. It's totally missing. The second point is it's totally missing from public discussion, public comment. There's no conferences on the recession of 2020. And that's because it's all about COVID, COVID, COVID. COVID appeared. The government locked the economy down as it did in other countries around the world. It invoked draconian measures. And so no one is terribly surprised that people were thrown out of work by the government, that companies were shut down, that professions were put out of work in a monstrous sort of way. Churches were closed. If you did go anywhere, you had to have a mask and a passport and a jab and so forth. But the official markings of that recession were that the peak in the economy occurred in February of 2020. And then, of course, in March of 2020, we had the COVID announcements in the beginning of the lockdowns. And then, lo and behold, the trough in the economy occurred the next month. So we went from peak to trough in less than 2 months. And so that's where you get the record for the shortest contraction in U.S. history. It's not your traditional business cycle, and everybody knows that. It's very COVID related in the sense that it wasn't the economy that by itself went into contraction and then to back into expansion. It was the government. And so we're really left without much of an explanation. So we have a situation where Austrians and even mainstream economists, even Fed economists, suspected a recession contraction. And then we had COVID hit, and everything was up for grabs. Literally, $10 trillion up for grabs. Okay, so it'd be worthwhile to take a look at the Fed's little book on the anatomy of the crash. Like most of our books, I think it's available for a free PDF if you can find it. Most of the articles in there, as I've mentioned, were published earlier in 2019. So you have, a dozen or more Austrian economists pointing in that direction. Most of the 20 essays directly address the government and in particular the central bank's complicity in setting the economic environment for a forthcoming crisis or debacle or catastrophe. Now, if we set that aside in interest of time, and let's look at what the Fed officials were also thinking, what they were saying publicly. And over the last week, I've gone back and digested some of the major speeches and a few of the minor ones by Fed officials in 2019.
And really what it is,
as I did
an unwanted microphone
for the Fed officials, Chairman Powell, Vice Chair,
showing that
Board
it's picking up
of
audio.
Governors, and so
So I
forth.
scroll
They
through
go out and
see
give
if
talks
anything
all
else
the time.
is picking up audio currently. So
To
look at this list
influence
to
public
how many
opinion.
devices you're actually using.
And in 2007, they were saying
File,
everything was great.
and then go to
And
settings.
the Fed was in
And
charge.
then settings,
Nothing
go to
could
audio,
go wrong.
and
You
under
can find
devices,
that
go
article as
ahead
well.
and disable all of the devices and see if that.
Excuse me.
Once you hear the
But in 2019, the Fed was widely optimistic. Certainly at the beginning of 2019, they were emphasizing the Fed's success coming out of the 2008-9 crisis, the very long expansion, and the reasons why everyone should have confidence in their game. And I emphasize confidence, which is really used by people in two different ways. We have confidence in people and their abilities. We have confidence in the workers who show up to our businesses and factories. But confidence is also has a negative way that you're putting something over on people. So where the Fed officials speak in terms of the first view that you should have confidence that they always do things correctly, that they're always on time, that they're working in the public interest. My view of the type of confidence that we have in the Fed as it is as in a confidence game. In other words, they build your confidence up in order to take your money away. They build your confidence up in order to take your money away. So, what were they saying? What were they telling business leaders, community leaders all across the country, as well as the mainstream media? Well, number one, that inflation was low. Inflation was near their target. As a matter of fact, inflation was too low. And of course, that's continued through 2020 and even 2021. That's no longer true. Inflation is way over their target. So yeah, at the time for the Fed, inflation was too low, which of course people stop me on the street and all the time and say, I sort of understand the Fed, but why are they talking about the inflation rate being too low? That just seems moronic, and it is. In terms of unemployment, again, remember we're talking about prior to 2020, they said unemployment was low. And in fact, it was unusually low. It was historically low. And labor participation rates were actually holding up pretty well, something that they're worried about now. So as far as inflation and unemployment was concerned, things were almost too good to be true. And this is what those Fed officials called the new normal. that we're just going to have to put up with these unusually stubborn bad times of inflation being too low and unemployment being too low. And how was the Fed going to get all this back in balance? How were we going to get inflation up, and how were we going to smooth out the labor market? They never actually say they want people to be unemployed. They want businesses to be destroyed. They want people to lose their homes. But that's what they do. They just don't like to talk about it in those terms. So through most of 2019, things were too good to be true for the Fed. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why Austrians were starting to beat the drums and predicting an economic crisis coming. Well, some things didn't go quite according to plan. There was a financial hiccup in markets in September. It was kind of a little bit of an emergency. It was sloughed off after the fact as just a liquidity problem. And then shortly thereafter, they announced that they were going to stop and maybe reverse their policy on the balance sheet. You'll remember that the Fed massively increased their balance sheet with government debt and mortgage-backed securities after the housing bubble to restore confidence, and that they had started for a few years selling off a few of those assets. They never really got very far with it. And then they started pushing down the federal funds rate. So they were already starting to gear up for a contraction in the economy. They had these problems. They made these adjustments. But even though they mentioned some other things, they never really took notice of it. So they mentioned that global trade was slowing down. That's also a sign of an economic crisis. Trade had diminished. And again, this is in 2019 before COVID. That could be sloughed off as just Trump and the populists enacting protectionist measures. Manufacturing was slowing, contracting in some subsectors. Also, investment in capital was softening. So that things that Austrians look at in terms of being worried about the business cycle, the Fed looked at those, made note of them, but then made no connection to the business cycle, even though the global economy, international trade, manufacturing and real goods, and investment in capital and durable goods was softening and weakening, and should have been a sign. But of course, mainstream economists, and certainly the Fed policy directive, is to look at the inflation rate, or CPI, and the unemployment rate. And those general aggregate statistics did not present any problems to them. Their big problem in 2019 with CPI and the unemployment rate was that they were too low. So they weren't even looking at the right things. At least they weren't speaking publicly about looking at the right things. Now, all of those issues, yes, they're business cycle related, but there's other causes for changes in the global economy and trade and manufacturing and capital investment. But when they all turn soft and they all turn negative, it's time to stand up and look at what they're doing. So, again, looking at this looming economic crisis in 2020 that never really materialized because of COVID, this is a topic that was debated within Austrian circles. And I'll mention in particular George Selgin and Joe Salerno sort of hashed this out. And this is recounted in Salerno's article from 2017, where he counters Selgin and the new Keynesians who felt that the Fed was being too restrictive with the money supply, which is hard to believe, I know. But Joe Salerno took him serious, took a serious consideration of what they were saying, and said, based on his analysis, that the Fed really was holding down interest rates, that the Fed really was inflating the money supply and causing the conditions that would necessitate an economic correction of some sort. So you have the mainstream new Keynesians and the Fed economists, and George Selgin on one side saying the Fed was too tight since 2008. They were not too easy. Interest rates were not too low. And they complained about things like the Fed paying interest on excess reserves. So they did not expect a recession, a contraction, and so forth. But Salerno went back and looked at the economy from 2011 to 2017 for his 2017 article. And he said, well, actually, the money supply has been growing. There was a small dip in the money supply, but over that period of time, the money supply was broadly expanding. There's no question about that. He also noted that there was increased spending in the economy. GDP was going up. And as a matter of fact, the expansion between those two dates, which is 7+ years, the economy was expanding by between 2.5% and 5%. And also, inflation did not go away. It was relatively low, but it did not go away. And we were not facing deflation, the scourge of mainstream economists, but we were experiencing positive price inflation. So he said basically we had inflation in both absolute and relative terms, and we had price inflation even though there was diminished velocity of money and without really a big increase in productivity. So by all the measures that are typically looked at by the new Keynesian mainstream economist, money supply, spending, and price inflation, all of those things were up during that period that was being debated. And then if you follow that period, 2017 to the recession of 2020, you find that the money supply continued to increase. And actually, there was a very high rate of increase there. And the only slippage comes in early 2020. Secondarily, GDP continued to increase. there was a slight slippage in GDP growth in the last quarter of 2019, which of course caught our eye on the Austrian side of the field. Um, but the steep slide in things like GDP only began at the end of the first quarter, at the beginning of the first quarter of 2020, before COVID. So the things that Salerno re-examined, the things the Keynesians claim to be problematic, money supply, GDP, and CPI, those were all fine from the financial crisis of 2008-9 up until 2020. And then we start to see these slippages. And we start to see slippages in other statistics. For example, in December of 2019, we set a record for the most job openings in the economy. So the available jobs that you could apply for in the US economy in December of 2019 was at an all-time high. And yet, by the time COVID and the COVID crisis came around and all of those job listings evaporated, there was already a significant slippage in that number. So when I look at the numbers, we see slippage in all of those major trends prior to COVID actually hitting and actually coming online. Of course, everybody realizes that it had been floating around a little bit for a short time, but nothing to disturb macroeconomic statistics. I apologize for the coughing. It's something brand new. I'm not sure why I'm doing it, but I do apologize for it. So I think that leads us to the conclusion that whatever you think, from 2008 until 2020 was an extremely long economic expansion as measured by mainstream economists themselves. And also, it seems to me that in 2019, late 2019 into early 2020 was a period of transition, and it was a transition to at least an economic correction or recession or something worse, possibly. But whether we look at the macroeconomic statistics, money supply, bank loans, GDP, CPI, we look at microeconomic statistics like job openings, and so forth, those all point into the direction of a transition to correction that never was allowed to take place because of COVID. Now, with COVID in March of 20, you have an explosion of weapons of monetary destruction by the Fed. Trillions of dollars of liquidity are added into the economy. In terms of the US Treasury and Congress, there was an explosion of spending, of money being given out, an explosion of the deficit, and of the national debt by trillions of dollars. I think the total was at one point something like $10 trillion was committed to getting us through the COVID emergency. In my perspective, what it did was reestablished the inflationary expansion of the previous decade. And in light of that, in light of the idea that, well, they've reignited a previous existing bubble because it had not really collapsed entirely, and having the cover of the COVID crisis in place, meant that we've got a reinflated bubble in the American economy that continues sort of to this day. Um, that doesn't happen very often. The normal conditions are the Fed, takes an easy money path, typically prior to an election. They lower interest rates. They expand monetary policy. Uh, there's more investment. There's new technology. There's hiring that goes on. The economy expands into a bubble if if the stimulus is enough, and then of course inflationary price pressures start to build. Um, the Fed has to cut back on its expansionary plans, and the economy goes into a contraction. So it's like the typical business cycle, up and down. In this case, what we had is an expansion and then a blip down and then a reinflated bubble. So, in terms of bubbles, the current situation could probably best be characterized as much worse than normal. Okay, so that's basically um, what I'm trying to start the debate about, is exactly where we are right now, in terms of the business cycle, and more importantly, to try to head off, to try to take away the ability of the Fed to use this experience as a justification for trying to bail out a forthcoming economic crisis with even more destructive weapons of monetary policy. Um, if they can take credit for helping us through the COVID emergency, um, then they can justify things like the current inflation, possibly the inflation rate getting much worse, even though right now market participants are sort of expecting, well, the inflation seems to be going away. Gas prices are where they used to be, um, that sort of thing. Um, so we can't let the Fed have that excuse. Um, and of course, that takes people outside of economics to undermine the case that what the Fed did and what the government did to us and to our economy during the COVID, um, was necessary. And of course, to me, what they did, was both unnecessary and harmful. It didn't help anybody, and it may have hurt some people uh, rather dramatically. May have killed some people, but that's not my area of expertise. My area of expertise in this case is knowing and experiencing the Fed's ability to use its public microphone, um, to rewrite history in such a way that it makes the Fed looks like the savior rather than the villain in the economy. And I really dread the idea that they'll be able to look back on 2020 without any opposition, really, and say, if we didn't do what we did then everybody would have died. It's kind of like a drug war argument. If we didn't have drug prohibition, everybody would be either dead or at least strung out on heroin. And this is the type of control over our thoughts and our thinking that they seek. And I think the facts do not in any way justify that type of thinking, that type of rationale. And so we need to buckle up and be ready for the economic crisis. Materially speaking, we want to have low debt. We want to have plenty of savings. We want to have extra ways of earning money if possible. We want to be self-sufficient to some degree. We want to protect ourselves. We want to protect other people. But intellectually, we have to protect ourselves against the Fed. We really need to go on the offensive against the Fed, because I fear, the next crisis and the Fed's response. These things are not costless, and the types of things we may lose in the next round or two of these Fed interventions. I mean, I couldn't possibly imagine the types of things when I was in college, the types of things my government and the Fed itself do on a routine basis. They just were completely off the table, unimaginable what they've already done. So what they might do in the next few years is a really scary proposition, and I hope we're all ready for it. And so I thank you for your attention. I thank you for the invitation to be here, and I apologize for the coffee.
No problem at all. Unfortunately, because of the technical difficulties, we are going to have to forego any Q&A here. But where can all the good people listening here find you at?
Well, of course, Mises.org is the main place. A lot of my stuff is chronicled there. I'm working on a new book about this very situation right now, and a good part of it will be based on some of the things that I've already written as daily articles or speeches that I've given at events like this, or at Mises Institute events. We have a full lineup of events this year around the country. I hope to see some of you at those events or online watching some of those events. This could be one of the most exciting and unfortunately interesting years in history, at least, looking out into the short term future. So, and on Twitter, I'm Dr. Mark Thornton, DrMark Thornton. Of course, Twitter is what you get what you pay for. But yeah, I hope you continue to be on the lookout for this topic and what the Fed is doing. Thank you.
All right, absolutely. Thank you very much for being here today. Okay. All right, so we're going to have Walter Block in here in just one moment. The Zoom link has been sent to him. Again, apologies for all the technical difficulties here. We had some issues with Dr. Thornton's mic, wasn't working for some reason, and we had to make the quick audible over to Zoom and YouTube live stream a little bit before we were ready, but we're kind of figuring things out on the fly. But everything should be running smoothly from here.
everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We really do appreciate it. We're just waiting for Walter Block to arrive. Again, we've made an audible here. So we are live streaming on YouTube. The YouTube link is in the conference chat section. Again, thank you for your patience and understanding. We really do appreciate it.
Dr. Block, are you with us?
I am. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing today?
Hanging in there.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to give you a quick introduction and then we're going to get started. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, Walter Block is a name that I'm sure that many of you, if you've been in the Liberty Movement at all, are familiar with. He has quite a list of accolades here. He is the Harold E. Wirth Eminent Scholar of Economics at Loyola University in New Orleans. He's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute and author of many books, including Defending the Undefendable, The Privatization of Roads and Highways, and more papers than anyone could ever read. So with that being said, Dr. Block, you have the floor.
I have the floor for what? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to talk about?
Money inflation in the state is the theme for our conference here.
Oh, I see. I thought you were going to interview me. You want me to sort of talk about it?
Yeah, we have a Q&A session afterwards, so we can do some questions there.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize. I thought you'd be asking me questions. Say that again. Money,
inflation, and the state.
Money, inflation, and the state. Okay. Money. Why do we need money? Well, the obvious answer is to buy stuff, but that would be on an individual level. Why do we need money as a society? Would be another question. And I think the answer is to facilitate trade. Because without money, we'd have barter. And barter has the problem of the double coincidence of wants. So, for example, if I have a chicken and I want a pickle, I have to find someone who's got a pickle and wants a chicken. And the odds of that are slim to none. So what I'll do if I have a chicken is I'll trade it in for something that most people would accept, say salt, or I don't know, gold. And then I would make two trades. Now you might think it's more efficient to just make one trade, pickles for chicken, but it doesn't work out that way because of the double coincidence of wants. So I'll make two trades. I'll trade in the chicken for salt, and then you have pickles, and you don't really want a chicken, and you don't even really want salt, but you'll take the salt because you know that you want a bicycle, and you can go and buy a bicycle with the salt. So that's why we need money. So now the next question I think arises, well, what would be a good money? Salt would be pretty good money. Cigarettes were used in prisoner of war camps to facilitate trades. Gold and silver are very, very good. Bananas wouldn't be a good money because they rot after a few days. Cement wouldn't be a good day or a good money, or sand, because you need a lot of weight and cubic to to facilitate any trade because they're so cheap. Sand, you need a ton of sand to buy a bicycle, and who wants to carry a ton of sand around? Diamonds would not make a good money because you can't make change in them. If you break a diamond in half, I think the two halves are worth 1/8 of what the bigger diamond was worth, something like that. So they wouldn't be a good money. So whenever people were free to choose, there was a competition between what should be the money, and usually gold won out. Now it's interesting. Milton Friedman has this series, a TV series, Free to Choose, and yet he is I won't say viciously against gold, but strongly against gold would be a better way to put it. And yet free to choose. Whenever people were free to choose, they chose it. So what's his argument? His argument is, well, it costs money. You have to dig up the gold. You have to find it, you have to look for it, you have to dig it up, and then you have to store it somewhere, and you need locks and keys and a safe deposit box or something like that. It costs money, and we can do it cheaper. Just have little pieces of paper uh, that sort of piggybacked onto the gold. And my argument against that would be, well, just because it costs money doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I mean, I have a shirt. It costs money. Does that mean I shouldn't have a shirt? You have glasses. It costs money. Should you not have had glasses? Uh, it seems like a silly argument just because it costs money. Uh, I mean, we do put money, we do buy locks and keys and fences, which cost money. Why? To protect property. Well, gold is a good protection against property, a good protection of property, because whenever government gets involved, well, let's look at it from the government's point of view. They have only three ways to raise money. One is taxes, and everyone knows who's responsible for taxes. It's really hard for the government to come and say, "Well, it's capitalism that's responsible for taxes." Even Biden wouldn't go so far as to say, "Well, you know who's responsible for taxes? It's free enterprise." Even he wouldn't say that. Everyone knows that government is the taxing authority. Even low information voters know that. I think. I'm not sure about that.
I'd hope so.
Don't push me too hard. The second way is borrowing, but again, everyone knows who's doing the borrowing. It's a government bond, or government is borrowing the money. Well, the third way is inflation, and nobody knows the cause of inflation. I mean, unless you're knowledgeable. So how many people are knowledgeable about that? It's a lot easier to blame inflation on profits, on I don't know, on high prices. It's the other way around, but on capitalist greed. You can even blame it on unions. Some lefties blame inflation on unions because unions want to raise wages. And then the consumer is greedy, the consumer is buying stuff and raising prices. So it's a wonderful thing for government to have fiat currency, or what do you call it? Um, uh, Dollars, U.S. dollar, the franc, the rand, whatever it is. And then they just increase the amount of it, and now they've got more money, and nobody's blaming them. Everyone's blaming somebody else. So that's why the government is intent on squelching gold. And if ever, what's that, Bitcoin becomes too popular, they'll squelch that too. Look, they'll pass a law saying you use a Bitcoin and you go to jail because you're anti-democratic, or whatever it is. So that would be one chapter of the story. Another chapter of the story from the Austrian point of view is that when the government increases the supply of money, what they do is they lower the interest rate. Think of a supply and demand curve, and over here you have money, and over here you have the interest rate. Well, you shift the supply curve of money, the interest rate falls. And that's a big problem from the Austrian point of view, not so much from anyone else's point of view. We Austrians are weird. We're a bunch of perverts. We're looking at interest rates. Who looks at interest rates? Very esoteric kind of a thing. You see, the problem, suppose that, well, what would the interest rate be established at if the government were not involved, if we had pure laissez-faire? It would be based on time preference. The idea is some people are impatient. They want now, now, now. Think of a 6-year-old kid. You offer him a choice of, what is it, 1 chocolate bar now or 5 chocolate bars tomorrow. He wants that 1 chocolate bar now. Whereas other people are not as impatient. They're willing to lend. Whereas the 6-year-old kid would not be lending money. He'd be borrowing money to get now, now, now. So the interest rate is based upon the supply and demand of all people in the society, well, especially the marginal borrower and lender, but roughly speaking, all borrowers and lenders, which is everyone potentially is a borrower or lender. And we have an interest rate, and it's based on the time preferences of the society. So if the society were composed of 6-year-old kids, it'd be a very high interest rate. To entice people to lend, you'd have to offer them the sun, the moon, and the stars, an arm and a leg. Um, Whereas if you had middle-aged people who were less impatient, the interest rate would be a little lower. And now let's suppose that the interest rate is 4%. That's the equilibrium interest rate. And now what the government does is it lowers the interest rate just to 3%. Well, what's that going to do to present discounted values of money receivable in 1 year? It'll increase it a little bit, 1% or I don't know, very little. What will it do for money receivable in 20 years? It'll raise the present discounted value of money receivable in 20 years very significantly. When I teach this in my classes, I have an interest rate table in front of everyone, and you can see that it's a real radical difference between 20 years and 1 year, the effect of lowering the interest rate. Well, what does this mean? What this means is that if you invest in a roundabout process that will end in 1 year, you'll make a little bit more money than you would otherwise at 3% than at 4%. But if you invest in investment roundabout process of production, say a coffee tree, or I don't know, coffee trees take a while from the time you plant them to when they give off coffee, or you build a building. Right now you're in front of the Mises Institute. How long did it take to build that building? Well, more than a year. Especially if you look at all the raw materials and the metal and the wood and all that went in there. So what happens is that people are led as if by Adam Smith's invisible hand to start producing more roundabout long-term projects than otherwise. But the saving investment rate hasn't changed one iota. Just because the government increased the money supply by whatever amount and lowered the interest rate doesn't mean that the saving and investment decisions of the people has changed at all. So what you have is a sort of a misallocation of resources through time. Let me make this point not through time, but at a moment of time. An analogy. Suppose that the ideal amount of peas and carrots is 50% and 50%. People's taste is such that we want, of all the money allocated to peas and carrots, we want half peas and half carrots. Fine. But what the government does is it starts subsidizing carrots. Don't ask why. Just work with me here. And now we have 75% carrots and 25% peas. But the people still want 50 and 50. So what we're going to have is a depression in the carrot industry when people are allowed to produce, because we're up to our armpits in carrots, and we don't want that many carrots, and we keep wanting to buy peas, and the profits in peas are much higher, and the profits in carrots are much lower, and we have a depression in carrots, if and when the government stops doing this. Well, if and when the government stops increasing the money supply, and they have to stop eventually because these things are additive. If they keep inflating without end, we're going to get into a hyperinflation of Germany 1923 because of expectations. The idea here is, suppose prices have been level for many, many years, and all of a sudden the government increases money supply and prices rise. People expect the prices to come down, because the prices are always going up and down, and now they went up a little, so we expect they'll go down. Well, if you expect that prices go down tomorrow, what do you do today? Do you buy more or less today? Well, you buy less today because you expect prices to go down tomorrow, so you buy tomorrow. So what I'm now talking about is, what is it, the quantity theory of money? The quantity theory of money says, well, that prices are proportional to the money supply. No, because there's expectations. Initially, the government increases the money supply by 10%, and prices don't go up by 10%. They go up by a lot less because people are buying less because they think that tomorrow prices will come down and they'll buy tomorrow. So they're not buying today, so prices don't go up by 10%. But eventually people start, the government keeps increasing the money supply, and people start saying, whoa, prices aren't going down. They're going up. So now the government keeps inflating the money supply at 10%, let's suppose, or Friedman would say at 2%. I'm just using an example of 10%. And people start saying, hey, prices aren't coming down. They're going to be higher tomorrow. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to start buying today. So prices go up by more than 10% when people have an expectation of inflation. So eventually the government's got to stop. They get scared. Jimmy Carter had, what was it, 20% inflation? We're very, very high. We're not even near there. I think we're still in single digits, 8 or 9%, which is a lot higher than it used to be before Biden got in there. Say what you will about Donald. Donald, did a good job on. He did a good job on many things, but and one of them was that a relatively good job. A real good job would have been to appoint Ron Paul as head of the Fed, with the order to Ron get rid of the Fed in 1 week. Well, maybe 1 day, because let me get off that one. But okay, so eventually the government has got to stop inflating, because it'll take off. And when they stop inflating, what's happening is, instead of a depression in carrots, there's going to be a depression in heavy industry. Usually when there's a depression, there's not much of a depression in consumer goods or goods of 1 year roundaboutness, but there's a big depression in goods of 20-year or 50-year roundaboutness. So we now have a 5-minute version of the Austrian business cycle theory. And the idea here is that inflation not only creates that government increase in the money stock not only increases inflation, or not is inflation, but it also creates the Austrian business cycle theory. And here we diverge from the mainstream. The mainstream sees that depression is something very bad. We see depression as something, well, not very good, but necessary. It's sort of like if you get drunk the night before, that's the boom, and then next morning, what you really should have is some coffee and some aspirins, because you got drunk last night, and that's the depression, and that would be good. But what the government does in 1921, and Tom Woods wrote a very good book on this. In 1921, what the government did was pretty much nothing, and the whole thing went away in a matter of weeks or months. Whereas in 1929, and it was not just JFK, not JFK, who's
FDR.
the guy? FDR. Thanks. I need all the help I can get. It was also Hoover. Murray Rothbard wrote about the Hoover depression. What they were trying to do is prop up these roundabout businesses. They wouldn't allow the carrot industry to fail. The carrot industry should have failed because there were resources in the carrot industry that were not necessary. And now there were resources invested in roundabout methods of production that were not justified by the saving and investment decisions of the people. So instead of having coffee and aspirin like we did in 1921, we had more booze the next morning, and then we wondered why we're still drunk. So that's why the depression went on and for a long time. And Bob Higgs did some good work on showing that what stopped the depression was not World War II, but eventually they stopped misallocating resources. They stopped drinking booze in the morning, and the thing went away, namely following 1921. So I don't know. I think I've spoken for 20 minutes or so. I'm sort of running out of steam. I mean, you gave me the money, Austrianism, inflation, and I think I gave you 20 minutes worth. So is there a Q&A now that we can start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go ahead and just kick off with the first question here. With inflation being in the news a lot over the past year because of obvious reasons, I think what it's really illustrated is just the economic ignorance of many people in the United States, but in the West generally. So just with that idea in mind, what do you think about the economics education of the general population that exists today, or lack thereof?
Economics education of the general population, lack thereof, is the key. I mean, I don't know. I teach at Loyola University, And every year I get freshman students in my intro courses, and and you mention something like price gouging, and they go, oh, price gouging, oh, that's horrible. You mentioned something like minimum wage. Well, minimum wage is great. Minimum wage will cure poverty. We'll just raise it to $100 an hour, and we'll all be rich. I mean, the level of, and these are bright kids. Uh, it's not Harvard. The kids aren't as bright as the Harvard kids. But then again, the professors aren't as bright as the Harvard professors. But they're pretty bright, and they just graduated from high school. And their economic knowledge is abysmal. So when you say economic knowledge of the general public, it's not only lacking, it's sort of negative. It's that they know things that aren't so. If they had no knowledge, that would be a step up. But they have knowledge of falsity or false knowledge or whatever it is. I mean, they're filled with Marxism and economic Marxism and cultural Marxism and Marxism here and there and everywhere. One of my articles that I did with Bob Eckhart and John Levendis was asking why. Why is it that people are so economically ignorant? And the answer we gave, I think, is a good one. It's sociobiological. We human beings were formed a million years ago, or whenever it was. We were in the caves or the trees, and we lived in groups of 20, 25 people, and the 25 people were all our cousins or aunts and uncles or parents, and there was an impetus, a payoff for benevolence. If you're sick this week, I take care of you. Next week, I'm sick, you take care of me. Our tribe survives. This week, you're sick, I don't take care of you. Next week, I'm sick, you don't take care of me. That tribe doesn't last. So we have benevolence. So when I get these freshman kids, look, if you're in a restaurant and somebody starts choking, you're not going to just keep eating. What you're going to do, even if it's a total stranger, you're going to go grab them and do the Heimlich maneuver, or you're going to call a nurse or a doctor. I mean, you're going to feel very upset. And that's because we are hardwired for benevolence. Okay, there's a Hitler out there and there's a Stalin, but most people are pretty benevolent. We give charity even though the government takes a lot of money away from us. Most people, except for a few criminals and sadists, are benevolent. Why? Because of sociobiology. We're hardwired for it because that's what it took to survive and leave children to the next generation. So the genes for benevolence are deeply embedded in us. Well, what about the genes for economic appreciation? There aren't any. We didn't buy and sell in this group of 15 or 20, 25 people. When the hunters went out and caught a cow or a chicken or whatever they caught and hunted, we shared it. Because if you didn't share it, the tribe didn't survive. So we don't have any hard wiring for economic understanding. Now, you and I and a few people at the Mises Institute and a few people around the world, I don't know, 1%, 2%, are what's it called in biology? I forget the word. Mutants. We're mutants. We're weirdos. I didn't start out as a free enterpriser. I started out as a buddy of Bernie Sanders. He and I were in high school together, but I was open to it. You might not have started out, and maybe you did, but you were open to it. So we're mutants. We're weirdos. They're only, I mean, when Ron Paul runs, he should have been president when he ran for president, but he got the usual 2-3% of the vote. 2 or 3% of the vote of human beings are hardwired to be at least open to free enterprise. And what I do with my freshman students, I try to awaken that part of them by saying, well, price gouging is beneficial and the minimum wage is not beneficial. And I give them a lecture on money and inflation and business cycle of the sort that I just gave you. And I hope to awaken at least some of them.
All right, we have another question here. How would you respond to mainstream economists who believe that having some small, consistent amount of inflation is better for the economy?
Well, that's Milton Friedman, the 2% rule or the 3% rule. I forget which it was. Well, I don't think. First of all, it's theft. It's really theft. Uh, but it's only 2%, so it's okay. I mean, what you're doing is creating money, some value out of nothing. You're look. If you increase the prices by 2%, everyone has 98% of what they had before. Namely, they have 2% less. So just on ethical grounds, which is not really an Austrian thing, but I'm also a libertarian, and I would condemn that just on the basis of robbery. Getting back to positive economics, I think it creates the business cycle. Uh, Not much. Better 2% than 10%. Better 10% than 100%. I don't like to brag, but I'm a very wealthy man. I have a Zimbabwe dollar for $1 trillion. I'm very rich. I have, I think, I forget what I have. I don't even look at it that much. Uh, but that's the direction of inflation. It's a very dangerous thing. And 2% is a lot better, yes. And Friedman is what's his thing? Why 2% or 3%? Because the economy will grow by 2 or 3% every year on average, which is not totally unreasonable, and therefore the price level will not rise because yes, the money rose, but so did the goods, so the price level will stay the same, and that's the ideal. Whereas deflation is some sort of horror. I mean, they think that the reason we had the depression is we had the Fed didn't raise money, increase money by enough. That's the Friedman-esque, the Friedmanite view. You know, Friedman illustrates Murray Rothbard's rule. Murray Rothbard's rule is that the mainstream people specialize in what they're worst at. Now, Milton Friedman was really good, really excellent at many, many things. Minimum wage, unions, occupational licensing, I mean, free trade, rent control. The list goes on, and Friedman was magnificent. What does he specialize in? Money and also vouchers, where he's bad. So he sort of exemplifies the Rothbard rule of, being bad. That's what I would say to the Friedmanites or the mainstream economists who say that 2% is ideal because it flattens prices. There's nothing wrong with deflation. Look, when televisions first came out, they cost an arm and a leg. Now you can buy a new TV for $50, a crappy one. When computers came out, I remember when I was at Columbia doing my dissertation, the computer was the whole room. I mean, it was a gigantic room. Cribbe, CRBBE, it was the whole room, and it cost millions of dollars. Now I'm talking to you on a laptop. And this laptop can do more than than the whole kit and caboodle. And what's the laptop cost? I don't know, a few $100. Whereas a computer, when it first came out, cost a ton. Air conditioning, when it first came out, cost an arm and a leg. And now air conditioning is cheaper as we get better at producing these things. So there's nothing wrong with lower prices. Uh, so I would try to convert the heathen on that ground.
Next question here is: did Laura Davison's reply to a paper written by you and Dr. Bill Barnett change your mind about maturity mismatching?
Let me mention Laura and also Matt Mackay and Bob Bob Murphy. Uh, these three people are very, very good economists, and I'm friends with all of them. And they wrote actually, I'm getting off the topic. I'm changing the topic on you, but I'll get to maturity
Okay.
mismatching in a minute.
Perfectly
Uh,
fine.
what happened? I'm a professor. I'm not supposed to answer questions. I'm supposed to deviate.
Sorry, I didn't mean to corner you here, but
No. I'll get there. I'll get there. What happened is you mentioned my book, Defending the Undefendable.
Mhm.
I now have three versions of it, Defending 1, 2, and 3, with all new lists of characters. But in the first one, all three of them said they loved the book. The book was great. However, the chapter on the counterfeiter was no good.
Hmm.
And what was the chapter on the counterfeiter? It was defending counterfeiting. Not counterfeiting legitimate money, but counterfeiting illegitimate money, namely counterfeiting U.S. fiat currency. I said that was a mitzvah, a good deed. And the three of them wrote an article saying, well, it was not really good. We disagree with Block on this. and then I wrote rejoined all three, and I got the last word on that. So maybe I've convinced them. I don't know. Now back to maturity mismatching, which I confused for a second with counterfeiting. I'm getting old. I'm getting senile. You've got to work with me here. Maturity mismatching. I have not been convinced that Bill Barnett and I were wrong on maturity mismatching. What we're really now talking about is fractional reserve banking.
Hmm.
And fractional reserve banking, they all agree is a problem. Murray Rothbard said that it's per se a violation of rights because uh, you you come to my bank and with $100 deposit, and I give you a what do you call it, a checking account or a deposit or something, and now you can spend $100. And what I do now is I take 90 of it and I lend it out to Lou Rockwell, and I give him a checking deposit also. And now I've got $10 assets, and I've got $190 debt, instantaneous debt, not debt off in the future, because you both got demand deposits. You can both come in for 100 and Lou for 90, and I have to pay you out of my $10, and I can't. So what Murray says is that I'm bankrupt, and I should be put in jail or accused of a crime or whatever it is. And I think that's right. Well, maturity mismatching is uh, the same thing, is what Bill Barnett and I are arguing, because here what we're doing is you come in for a bank and you give me $100, and I say that what is it? I have to give it back to you in 1 year. And now I lend out the money to someone else for 2 years. Well, again, I'm bankrupt, not instantaneously, but the point is that my assets and my liabilities are not in sync. Namely, my assets are far off, and my liabilities are sooner, just like fractional reserve banking. So I think that maturity mismatching is very much like fractional reserve banking. And my problem with Laura, and not only Laura, but Phil Bagas and Dave Howden and Hernando. Oh, he's got such a long name. The guy from Spain, the leader of the Spanish Austro-Libertarian movement.
Hmm.
Where did De Soto? Sorry, I missed his name. It's a long name, and I'm missing a few of his names. Bill Barnett and I are in a debate with all of these people, but it's a friendly debate. Nobody's calling anyone a fascist. No one's calling anyone a Nazi. We're all Austro-libertarians. We're all Rothbardians. It's just that these are complicated issues, and people who start with the same premises, Austro-libertarian Rothbardianism, sometimes come to different conclusions, and it's good that we have journals like the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, like the Journal of Libertarian Studies, both put out by the Mises Institute, where we can debate these things and maybe come 1/1,000,000th of an inch closer to the truth.
Fantastic. All right, next question here is you had written a paper a while back with Dr. Barnett, who mentioned in the previous question, about Hayekian triangles. So do you still hold the views that you espoused in that paper, or have you changed your mind since then?
No, you know, uh, this is the second question, or third in a row. Have I changed my mind? And if I keep saying no, then people are going to say, well, he's obdurate. He won't. Um, I've changed my mind on a few things. I've changed my mind on intellectual property under the guidance of Stefan Kinsella. I certainly changed my mind under of anarcho-capitalism, thanks to Murray, and also on Austrian economics, thanks to Murray. So it's not that I'm sort of fixed, and the ideas I had when I was your age, I'll never change. I've changed a few, but not on Hayekian triangles. Um, Look, I still think in terms of Hayekian triangles because I was nurtured on Hayekian triangles. So whenever I think about the Austrian business cycle theory, I think in terms of Austrian triangles, and I think that it's a good heuristic device. If it'll help people think about Austrian business cycle theory, then I'm all for it. However, if you want to be technical about it, there are problems with it. I mean, one of the, I think in the paper we had 17 criticisms of it. I don't remember all 17. I have to reread the paper to come up with all 17. But let me just give you one or two. On the horizontal axis, you got two things. You got what is it, time, and then you have stages of production. You can't have two things on one what do you call it?
Axis.
One axis. That's a problem. Then the idea here is that think of a tall, skinny triangle and a short, fat triangle. The ideal is to have a vertical line. Namely, we want instantaneous production. So this would be much better. And yet on Hayek, this is very bad, and that's the better triangle. So that would be another problem with it. And we had 15 other criticisms of it. And I think, the interesting thing is, not that have I changed my mind, but has it changed the mind of anyone else? And Roger Garrison has done great work on this also with the triangle. Well, what he did is the Hayekian triangle had time on the vertical axis, and he put time on the horizontal axis, which it was his attempt to convert the mainstream, because the mainstream and even Austrians always think of time on the horizontal axis, so make it more palatable to them, and I think that was great. But he was sort of pro-triangle. Well, why didn't anyone, I mean, this article came out, 15, 20 years ago? Do you remember the day? I don't remember the date.
Something like that. Something like that.
15, 20. That's plenty of time for other people to write and say Hayek was right, Bloch and Barnett were wrong. Nobody ever responded. It's sort of like it was totally ignored. So if it's totally ignored, I assume everyone now agrees. Well, I really shouldn't assume that, but the burden of proof would rest with the Hayekians. And by the way, I think Hayek was a great economist. He did really important work. He wasn't as good a libertarian. He gave the store away too much, in my view. His road to serfdom was, just gave away the store. But I think the burden of proof is on people who want to defend that and say why we were wrong. Nobody ever wrote squat saying, well, they're wrong on this. When they do, I might change my mind. I mean, I'm open. Just because I wrote something doesn't mean that that I always stand by it. But somebody's got to say, well, here's why you're wrong. And Baggis and Howden and Huerta de Soto and Laura Davidson and Bob Murphy and Matt Mackay in Poland have all written things why they thought I was wrong, and I wrote back, and then they didn't write anymore. So I have to assume maybe they've been converted.
Next question here is that libertarians have often taken very different positions on the question of abortion. So, for example, you have Murray Rothbard, who was very staunchly pro-choice, and you have Ron Paul, who was very staunchly pro-life. So, the question here is, why is it that libertarians who are starting from essentially the same starting point come to very disparate conclusions on the question of abortion?
Why? Because we're not as smart as we'd like to be. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean, we're just human beings. And human beings have limitations. And it would be nice if we were twice as smart, if we had IQs of 3,000 or whatever it is. So that's one reason. Another reason, these are very complicated issues. One of my favorite quotes in all of political economy is from John Stuart Mill. And what John Stuart Mill says in On Liberty, he says something like, science is easy. Physics and chemistry are easy. But when it comes to really tough stuff, like philosophy, like economics, and then he goes on and says, there we really need open discussion or something like that. I'm giving a paraphrase. Well, I really don't know enough about physics or math or chemistry to know if it's true. I took all that stuff in high school and college, and I got C's by the skin of my teeth. I'm just not good at that stuff. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but I do know that the issues that we face are very, very complicated. So it's no shock that Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard, who are two of my parents, my fathers, intellectual fathers, take opposite views. And yet you can't, if you mention who are the two leaders of our movement, you'd have to come up with Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard. And yet, as you say, they have opposite views. One is pro-life, one is pro-choice. Well, I have a book on that and many, many articles, and I think they're both wrong. And sometimes, the followers like me can be more correct than the leaders because I can stand on their shoulders. And I think that evictionism is the correct libertarian view. So what's evictionism? Evictionism is the view predicated on property rights. Private property rights is the essence of libertarianism. And now we're off economics. We're not talking about positive economics. We're now talking about normative libertarianism. And for me, there are two major foundations of libertarianism. One is the non-aggression principle. You can do anything you damn well please. Just keep your mitts to yourself. Don't be grabbing anyone else or their property without their will. You can punch people if they agree to be punched, as in a boxing match. But otherwise, that's it. So the libertarian view would be, what libertarianism is a theory of what is the just or righteous use of violence. And it says you can do anything you want except murder, rape, theft, arson, kidnapping, fraud, whatever. Okay, that's one part of it. But another part of it is property rights. Suppose you're wearing a nice sweatshirt, me's a sweatshirt, and I come over and I grab it. Have I violated your rights? Well, it all depends upon who owns that sweatshirt. If you stole it from me yesterday, I'm just repossessing my property. I never saw it before. It's yours. So if I do that, I'm violating rights. So property rights are very, very important. Okay, so who owns the woman's body? The woman. She's the owner of her body. Now, the feminists will say ourselves, our bodies, but they don't really mean it. They're a bunch of pinkos, and the hell with them. But they're right. The woman owns her body. She is the owner of it. Now, let's take the case of rape. Woman's walking down the street. She gets grabbed. She gets raped. She gets impregnated. And now there's this little person growing inside of her. So we have to get to the issue of when does life start? I say life starts with the fertilized egg, because the sperm alone and the egg alone will not eventuate into anything. They'll just die. The fertilized egg in the right environment, namely the woman's body, will grow into a person. So I'm now a Ron Paulian. I believe that human life starts with the fertilized egg. Murray would say it starts with birth. Birth? Come on. The baby 1 minute before birth and 1 minute after birth is the same baby. He's as similar as he was as you and I a minute ago and a minute from now. It's just a change of address. The Jewish tradition, well, one Jewish tradition, the joking one, is that life starts when the baby graduates medical school, but that's just the real one is life starts with a heartbeat. Which is around the 7th, 8th, 9th week, somewhere in there. No, that's silly. Heart smart. The heart is irrelevant. Look, suppose I'm having a heart transplant thing. Well, the first thing they do is they take the heart out of me. Well, now I'm lying on the hospital bed, and you come and you shoot me. Did you shoot a dead body, or did you shoot a person? You shot a person, even though I had no heart. And without a heart, there's no heartbeat. So you're a murderer if you shoot me on the operating table. So I reject heartbeat. I reject birth. The fertilized egg is it. Okay, so now what do we call this baby, this small human being who is a product of rape, who's now sitting inside the woman's body? You know what I call him? I call him a trespasser. He's an innocent trespasser. It's similar to like if I drug you. And then I grab you and I put you in the Mises Institute, right? And you're a trespasser. right? I mean, you have no permission. I mean, right now you might be in a seminar there, but ordinarily, the Mises Institute owns the Mises Institute building. And if I put you in there drugged, you're unconscious, how do we describe you? We describe you as a trespasser. You shouldn't be there. Now, it's not your fault. You're an innocent trespasser. I'm the bad guy. I'm like the rapist. But the baby is in the property of someone else. Who owns that person? The mother. She's been there for 25 years. Let's say she's a 25-year-old woman. She's been with that body for 25 years. She's the homesteader of it. The baby is a trespasser. What do you have the right to do to innocent trespassers? Well, I think you have the right to evict them, not to kill them. If you kill them, you're a murderer because they're innocent. You have the obligation to evict them, not to kill them. Now, it just so happens that with today's medical technology, in the first 6 months, the first 2 trimesters, if you evict, the baby will die. However, in the last trimester, the 7th, 8th, and 9th month, if you evict the baby can live. So if we adopt evictionism, it's a real, compromise. 1/3 of babies will be saved. And by the way, as medical technology improves, then 4/9 of babies will be saved, and then 5/9. And you know, in 500 years, if we don't blow ourselves up, the baby will be viable outside of the womb right away, in some test tube or other. So if we adopt evictionism, medical technology will push us in the pro-life position. And I'm really pro-life in my heart, because I like human beings. Some of them are my best friends. So I want babies to be alive. But more important to me as a libertarian is private property rights. The mother owns that property and she has a right to evict. Okay, now one objection to what I've just been saying is very few babies are the product of rape. Most abortions are the product of voluntary sexual intercourse. So what about that? Is the baby really a trespasser? No, the baby is an invited guest. And if you invite somebody in, you have to take care of them. Well, look, if I invite you to my house for dinner, do I have to keep you there for 9 months? No. After the dinner is over, I say, I start hinting, don't you have to go home? So even if that were true, it doesn't mean you have to do it for 9 months, even if you invite the baby in. But there was no invitation, because for there to be an invitation, even an implicit one, there have to be an invitor and an invitee. Now look, I'm in favor of implicit contracts. You go to a restaurant and you order a cup of coffee and you drink it down, and then they give you a bill for $1 million. You don't have to pay $1 million. If they want to charge you $1 million, that's okay. I'm not for price control. But they have to tell you. Otherwise, there's no meeting of the minds. There's no contract. So I'm not against implicit invitations, but I insist there has to be an invitee. And at the time of sexual intercourse, there was no invitee, because remember, we said the baby doesn't come into being until there's a fertilized egg. But it takes anywhere, I looked this up, I knew this, it takes anywhere from a half hour to 24 hours for the sperm to get to the egg through the fallopian tube or something like that. I'm a little weak on biology. I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but it takes some time. At the time of intercourse, there is no invitee. There's one exception, and that's the host mother. Me and my wife are having trouble. We can't conceive. We want to conceive. So we get this woman and we say, look, here's a sperm. Put it inside of you, and we'll give you $100,000. And now, just do your thing for 9 months and then give us the baby. And what she does is she starts evicting the baby after whenever. Well, that's a violation of contract. And I believe in specific performance contracts, that we can hold her to that contract. And here I get into trouble with a lot of Murray Rothbard and Stefan Kinsella and what's his name, the title transfer theory guy. I forget his name. Bill Evers. They have this thing that you can only have, you can't have specific performance contracts. Like if I hired you to sing at my wedding, and at the last minute you bug off, I can't come up with a gun and say, get over there and sing or I'll shoot you. I say I can if that was the contract. I'm a contractual libertarian. These guys are just anti-contract. Or another one, I'm a tightrope walker, and I'm walking 100 feet on a tightrope, and I hired you to hire and hold a net under me, and in the middle of my act, you start walking off. I'm totally justified in saying, you get back there or I'll shoot you, because that was your contract. So I believe that the host mother has to keep that baby for 9 months because she agreed to do so. But that's the only exception where I would be a pro-lifer, namely, you can't even evict. But in every other case, you can evict, but you can't kill. So it's really a compromise between the two, and it's a principled compromise. See, an unprincipled compromise is you say 2 plus 2 is 4, I say 2 plus 2 is 6, so the compromise 2 plus 2 is 5. That's a compromise, but it's not a principled one because you can't deduce it from anything except you want to compromise. But the evictionism, you really can deduce it from libertarian theory, namely property rights. She's the owner of that property. QED. Murray is wrong and Ron is wrong. Now look, I respect I revere them, but they're human beings and they made mistakes.
All right, one last question here. How do you write so quickly? Do you have some sort of secret formula? And do you have any writing advice for any aspiring authors?
I have writing advice and also public speaking advice. The next one will be perfect. This one, you just do your best. Because you're never going to do anything perfect, ever. And if you have a perfectionist hang up, you're not going to write and you're not going to do public speaking. But if you reconcile yourself that you're going to do your best and you're going to make mistakes, and hopefully the good will outweigh the bad, and even if it doesn't in any particular case, you're doing your best, and that's all you can do. So that would be my advice for writers and public speakers. Don't get involved in perfectionism. I used to, when I first started, this one has to be perfect, and it never was perfect, so I couldn't write anything. Now, I went to Albert Ellis, a psychologist, over this, and he once said, what's the worst thing can happen? This is when I was cured, and the worst thing that can happen is I get into an audience and there are 500 people and they're all cheering and standing ovation before I even open my mouth, and then I start speaking and one by one they all walk out, and then, in about 10 minutes of my speech there's no one in the room. And when I could honestly say, well, I'm going to have to work on that speech, I was okay. Whereas if I would have said before the therapy, I would have said, well, I can't stand it, this is awful, then I wouldn't have been speaking or writing in the first place. The other part of your question is, well, how do I write so much? I love writing, and I love public speaking. I love what I'm doing with you now. I love teaching. I love spreading the word. I'm inspired by Murray and Ron to promote liberty, and I can't think of anything else I'd rather do. I got a nice salary from Loyola, but I tell you, if I got no salary, I would do it anyway, because I love it. Look, I'm doing this for free, right? You're not paying me anything, and I've spent, I don't know, an hour or so with you. I enjoy it very much. Sometimes I think that, I remember one time I wrote something, and some critic said, you're not going to convert anyone on that. And I said, conversion is good. I'm in favor of converting people to liberty, but really my motive is not to convert anyone. It's rather to get it off my chest. Because if I don't write or if I don't speak, I'll burst. I'll literally burst into 3,000 pieces. So I've got to keep going, and I enjoy it very much. And I sometimes think that if I were the last man on earth, or if I was on a desert island, I would still write even though no one would ever see it, because I enjoy getting it off my chest. It's the most beautiful thing. Liberty is more gorgeous than Mozart, and I'm a big, big fan of Mozart. It's more gorgeous than chess. It's more gorgeous than the smile of a baby's face. It's more gorgeous than a sunset. Liberty is magnificent, and I'm lucky that I have a talent, or I don't know, that I've been able to try to promote liberty, and I'm very thankful for my life.
Absolutely. Well, due to popular demand, I said that was going to be the last question, but I had several people request that I ask one more question here, so you'll have to forgive me if I get this one here. All right, this is a little bit of a long question, but I do think it's an interesting one, which is why it was requested. So the question goes like this. Mises and Rothbard and all the rest were all in favor of secession. And recently, many libertarians have also said that secession is only okay if it's being used to decentralize from a larger state. Other words, that secession would be seen as illegitimate. But Rothbard writes in Nations by Consent that he says, quote, every nationality should be allowed to secede from any nation state and join any other nation state that agrees to have it. And he specifically gives the example of the Eastern Fredonians and the inhabitants joining their comrades in Ruritania, these imaginary countries. But he says, in practice, this would seem to lead to some very unpleasant conclusions, such as the case of the Germans in the Sudetenland back in pre-World War II, joining back with Nazi Germany, for instance. So the question here is, what is the position that libertarians should have on secession? Should they allow it in all circumstances or only in certain circumstances where it's advancing the cause of liberty?
That's a vicious question.
I had several requests for this one, so I'm sorry. I'm doing this at gunpoint.
No. I think that's a good one, and I am honored to be challenged with a question that I never really thought about, and I should have thought about this one. Most questions that you ask, I already have an answer. This one, I'm going to have to wing it. I would say that a secession that promotes liberty is fine. No big deal there. But how about a secession that undermines liberty? The Sudetenland Germans join the Nazi group and make Nazism stronger. I have to go. No, I'm kidding. Where is Murray? Whenever I had a tough question like this, you know what I would do when Murray was alive? I'd call Murray. And there are very few people I can call on now. Most of the people that I can call on now are associated with the Mises Institute.
Mm-hmm.
Lou Rockwell, Jeff Deist, David Gordon. I would call them and say, "What do you think? Let's talk this out." I would say you can't do it. Stipulate that it's true that the Nazis will be strengthened by the Sudetenland Germans, draw them. In other words, there's no dispute over the facts. We're stipulating the facts. I would prevent it. I would say if you do that, you're undermining liberty and you can't do it. So secession is only good insofar as it embodies liberty, but liberty is the key and not secession. Now, it's usually 99% the two are, what do you call it, correlated or what's the word I'm looking for?
Synonymous with each other?
Synonymous, correlated, very similar. But here we have an anomaly. Here we have a case where, let me think if I can come up with another case. Here's one. Now I do have an answer, a pet answer. I have thought about this before. I just didn't put it together. Here it is. Suppose the Martians, all-powerful Martians, they say that unless we kill Hayek, they're going to blow up the whole world. Do we kill Hayek? I would say yes. I'm going to kill Hayek. This is sort of the, what do you call it, the problem? It's called the
trolley problem. Yeah.
It's really just the trolley problem. So we already have an answer to that. Yes, I'll kill Hayek. Stipulating that there's no doubt that the Martians are very strong and they will blow up the whole world and Hayek will die also. I'm going to kill him. And what should happen to me? Well, I'm a murderer. I should be killed. But then the Martians, they beam down another message. If you follow libertarian theory and execute Bloch for killing Hayek, we're going to blow up the world. And then I say, okay, look, libertarianism is by and large utilitarian. One of the benefits of libertarianism is that it promotes liberty. It promotes prosperity. It promotes human life, right? Yes, you can come up with weird cases. There's somebody else on our screen. Oh, Deirdre.
Hey, yes, she's our next speaker here.
Oh, I'm going past my time.
No, you're
Thank
not.
God.
No, you're not. No, you're not.
I say thank God because he's asking me tough questions. I want to get out of here. So I would just say that if you come up with these anomalies that show a divergence between libertarianism and utilitarianism, yes, there are such. And I go with utilitarianism. I don't want the whole world blown up. Sue me. I'm willing to give up liberty to save the whole world.
All right, sounds good.
But look at how weird they have to go to undermine liberty. They have to come up with Martians who not only want me to kill Hayek, but they don't want me to be executed for killing Hayek. Namely, they say that if you violate liberty, we're blowing up the world. Okay, so I don't want to blow up the world. I have a lot of friends here, including Deirdre and including you. I better get off because I don't want to take up Deirdre's time.
No. I'm not on for another 15 minutes, dear.
Oh, okay.
So
Well,
carry on.
I think I've answered the last question. This was a doozy. But that would be my answer. Yes, it's okay for us to stop the Sudetenland Germans from strengthening Nazism. That secession is a great thing, but not always. And so is the non-aggression principle a great thing. But here I am killing Hayek. So how good could the NAP be? Right? It's not the be-all and end-all because there are things that are more important. But by gum and by golly, without these weirdo cases, I think libertarianism is by far the best philosophy imaginable.
I completely agree.
Sounds good.
I mean, some kind of old-fashioned liberals, my friend Berta Mingardi, for example, is a little suspicious of helping Ukraine. And I say, no, we should help Ukraine because it's a defense of the liberal idea. Now, of course, if after the war, after they've defeated the Russians, as I think they will, they then turn fascist, I'll be very unhappy.
Well, Deirdre, I hate to disagree with you, but I must. I think that what should have happened in 1991 when the USSR fell apart and the Warsaw Pact ended, I think that NATO should have ended. And it should have been end of the Cold War. And what they did is they promised that there would be no eastward movement of NATO.
Yeah, and then they violated.
And they keep moving eastward, and now they're right on. Now look, take the case of the Russians when they put nuclear weapons in Cuba.
In Cuba, yeah.
It's very, very similar. The U.S. was upset.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I agree with you. I can understand that we made mistakes in the 90s, that's for sure. And I think you're right. Maybe we should have disbanded NATO.
Oh, absolutely.
But there are these bureaucratic interests that all of us know are very hard to turn around. And so I suppose we were in a second or third best or fourth best.
Yeah, but I'm sort of a fan of Russia in the Ukraine war. I mean, I regret
You are?
that. Yeah.
Oh, come on.
Because Russia was the victim. Because they keep moving eastward. Look,
I understand it. But from a sort of realpolitik point of view, I understand what you're saying. But from a liberty point of view, I think you and I agree that Putin is a danger and a bad man.
No, I'm pro Putin.
You don't think so? Oh boy, you're way out there then.
Well,
I mean, you always are, so that's good. I always say if Walter didn't exist, we'd have to construct him.
Well, this is very similar to what J.W. was asking me about Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard disagreeing on abortion. And what I was saying is these are very complicated issues, and we're pretty smart. We're probably smarter than a lot of people, but we're just struggling. And Deirdre and I start with the same premises, just like Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard start with the same premises, and come out on opposite points of view. And you know what we should do, Deirdre? We should co-author an article.
I know. But I'm so from a rhetorical point of view, I'm worried because you're so logical that I'll come out looking like an idiot.
Oh no, I don't think so.
This is what opponents of Milton Friedman will always say, that they would never want to debate with him, which was terrible. They should have debated with him. Not that he's wrong, but for intellectual honesty, they should. But no, I think if we were to, from what I just heard from you, I would think we could find a lot of common ground on the point of not committing a suicide pact with the non-aggression principle, for instance, right? We don't want to blow up the world.
Absolutely not. No.
Even though it might, allowing the world to be blown up might satisfy some axiom. Well,
Right. The axiom has got to go. Well,
intellectual consistency is not the only intellectual virtue.
Right. The hobgoblin of little minds, they say.
Exactly. Yeah. So how are you, dear?
Oh, good. Hanging in there, still teaching. They're still trying to get rid of me on
Well, I'm going to move to Cato. Are you aware of that? Next week, I'm going to be in Cato. I've got a job at Cato.
Wonderful.
It's starting on February 1st. I'm moving to an apartment right next door to Cato. So my commute is about 40 feet.
Great. Well, you're going to libertarianize them.
That's right. Well, yeah, I understand your point.
Yeah, they're the Beltway libertarians.
I know your views.
They're not as kosher as they could be.
Well, but your people down in Alabama, sometimes they go crazy. For this book that I'm working on Christianity and liberty, I'm discovering the views of, who is that guy in Alabama at the Mises Institute who was a Christian and wanted a theocracy? What was his name?
Oh yes. Oh,
This is
yeah.
Gary North you're referencing?
Gary North.
Yeah.
And gee whiz.
That's
no, thank you.
No, I disagreed with him on that. But if you're going to have a litmus test that you must agree on everything 100%.
No, that's not going to work.
That's not going to work.
I like vanilla ice cream, and if you don't agree with me, I'm not going to be your friend.
Right. No,
that's ridiculous.
I think Gary North made very important contributions, but not on.
I do too. Yeah, that's right.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But I will regard you as one of the most libertarian people at Cato. Going in.
Okay, I'll see. I'll see if that's true.
Give them my regards.
Thank you, dear.
Take care. I'm going to get off.
Okay, my love.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, you want to go and get started now, Dr. McCloskey?
Sure, let's do it. Don't call me doctor, or I'll have to charge you more.
Okay, my apologies. Well, I'll give you a quick introduction and then we'll get started.
Okay, let's do it.
All right. So for those of you who are unaware, Deirdre McCloskey is a distinguished professor of economics, history, English, and communications at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She is the author of The Bourgeois Virtues, Bourgeois Equality, Bourgeois Dignity, and many others as well. So with that being said, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, dear. I'm on slightly early. I have a dog barking in the background. I hope. Can you hold on just a moment, and I'll go close the door.
Absolutely.
And then I won't be distracted by the dog. It'll just take a second, then we can get started.
Foreign policy debate between Deirdre McCloskey and Walter Block was most unexpected, but
yeah, that was good though.
I enjoyed that very much.
I love Walter. He's terrific. As I said, if Walter didn't exist, you'd have to invent him.
Absolutely.
He's terrific. Let me get this back where you can see me. Okay. Well, I think there are a number of things I could talk about, um, but one that would be interesting to talk. I'm working on a book on Christianity and liberalism. I frankly don't much like the word libertarian. It was coined, as you know, in the 1950s. Um, and I think it's kind of off-putting. And I think now that our friends on the left, the progressives, are afraid of being called liberals, we ought to rush in and take back the word. Because I regard myself as a 19th century John Stuart Mill type liberal. And as Walter and I were just discussing, there are always going to be inconsistencies in any position you take, a broad position. And that's not the worst sin in the world. I think there's a tendency in liberal or libertarian circles to elevate consistency to the only intellectual value or the only social value there is. And I don't think that's right. I think it's hard enough to get things right that we don't need to follow axioms all the way necessarily. For example, I'm only a latecomer to Austrian economics. And I have Austrian friends who say, oh, we don't need to do empirical work. As one who I'm thinking of says, we know that water goes downhill. And if we have that axiom, we don't need, if we have the axiom of self-interest and then from an ethical point of view, the non-aggression principle, that's all we need. And so we don't need to do statistical work or experiments or even historical studies of the facts. And I don't think that's right. Of course, I'm an economic historian, trained as a conventional Samuelsonian type economist and taught for a long time at the University of Chicago. And, I do quantitative work in economic history. And I can't quite get rid of the idea that there's something to be learned by looking at how people act, and what history has been like and so forth. Now, I got a couple of things I could talk about, and one that I'll reserve for another occasion is a book I'm working on. It's called God's Economy. Public theology for an age of innovism. And the phrase public theology is a term of art in schools of, departments of religion, and schools of divinity. And it means religious issues viewed from the social point of view, what our beliefs in God or not in God imply about about the economy or the society. So that's that book. But a more radical, sort of consistent libertarian paper I'm working on, which fits with a book that Alberto Mingardi and I are doing on what we call the plausible illiberals. That is, people like Ashimoglu, the economist, and the old example would be John Kenneth Galbraith, people who call themselves liberals and think of themselves as liberals, who are actually statists actually believe in the efficacy of state action. And in particular, what I can talk about, and we can have a discussion about it, is a paper that I wrote last year called The Impossibility of Policy. And there I make the case, to the best of my ability historically and economically and philosophically, that the whole idea of policy is misused, misconstrued, is a bad idea. Now, in the history of economics over the last century, economists have become more and more convinced that they have a responsibility, a writ, to make up new policies. I have friends who do this. At Cato, where I'm going to be start working next week, we tend to specialize in anti-policies. That is, policies that disband the earlier policy. But the idea that most economists have, who are not 19th century liberals or libertarians, is that the job of the economist is a social engineer, that we're to seek the utilitarian maximum happiness for the maximum number, which, by the way, is mathematically impossible. And it's that view, which I call Samuelsonian economics, that's become prevalent. The sort of line of descent is Pigou at Cambridge, in his book, The Economics of Welfare, published around 1921, great big thick thing. And then from that you get to Keynes, and then to Samuelson, and then to Joe Stiglitz. And actually these people are personally connected too. And there it is. That's the 100-year history of this idea that economists should be thinking up over and over again new schemes for nudging. Bob Frank, my friend at Cornell, has said to me once, "Oh, Deirdre, don't you understand nudging? That is, organizing forms that you fill out for government policy, for government aid or something like that, or taxes. You can nudge people by designing them in a way that they make the optimal investment, according to you, the economist, in, say, their pension. And you can just nudge them, and we'll be." And he said, "Oh, Deirdre, you're a libertarian. Don't you understand? Nudging is paternalistic liberalism." And I said, "Bob, stop it. That's a contradiction in terms." And my sort of underlying point about policy is that it's very much making people, our fellow citizens, into children. And if you had to have another word for liberalism, I'd call it adultism. Because all other economic and political philosophies assume that people are incompetent children. Now, look, I've had a couple of children. I know lots of people with children, and I know that you've got to, as an adult, you've got to take care of them, and you don't make them go out to work to pay for lunch or anything like that. You can't use the market within a family. Indeed, one of the problems we have in persuading people not to advocate for socialism is that everyone comes from a family which is necessarily a socialist enterprise, and should be, from each according to her ability, to each according to his need. But the trouble is that any other economic, political philosophy you can think of wants to keep adults as children, either as the conservatives, standard issue conservatives, would say that they're bad children. They're bad children. So we got to have lots of police, and the army needs to come out and keep them under control because they're bad children. And on the left, the view is more that they're sad children. They're either bad or sad. On the left, they're sad, and oh, the poor things, they need to be fed. And either of these, either bad or sad, is corrupting of adult responsibility, of the adultism that I see as the great gift of liberalism. If you kind of take a long perspective, as a historian, I'm always doing this, and look at political philosophy and economic philosophy in the last 3 centuries, there have been 3 big ideas. And the first one was the distinctively 18th century idea, not deeply rooted in Europe, but anyway, it happened in Northwestern Europe, and that's liberalism. What Adam Smith called the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Well, it was not so obvious to most people in the 18th century, but this small group of liberals like Adam Smith, I always cross myself when I mention Adam Smith. I did that in church this morning, and they were very amused. Someone mentioned Adam Smith, and so I crossed myself. That's idea number 1. It's 18th century. The next big idea was nationalism. There were nations before, but nationalism as a conviction that people who speak the same language should have a country of their own is very much an early 19th century idea. The unification of Italy and then Germany were both this kind of thought. And then the third idea, coming in the middle of the 18th century with precursors back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is socialism. So liberalism, nationalism, socialism. And I claim that the first one was a great idea and made the modern world. I've written books and articles on economic history showing, to my satisfaction, that what made the modern world was not the modern nation state or various forms of socialism, but the liberties to innovate, especially to innovate, that came with liberalism, with letting poor men and then slaves and then women and then colonial people and then gays and then, then women again, freeing young people even, made for a creative society and an enormous increase in innovation in the last couple of centuries. And that's what made us rich, not investment, not better allocation, as the institutionalists tend to say, and certainly not central state action. That made us rich. And the other two, the nationalism and the socialism, well, I don't need to, in this conversation, I don't need to spend a lot of time showing that they've been real disasters. My joke is that if you like nationalism and socialism, maybe you'll like national socialism, which was both nationalist and socialist. So the point of this paper that I've done, which is available on my website, The Impossibility of Policy, is to go through the various arguments in favor of this notion of policy in the economy. Adam Smith used the word policy and police interchangeably, and that's about right. Mises and Hayek, being Austrians, had a kind of a little joke about economic policy. They called it Prussian police science. As Southerners from Austria, they sneered at the Prussians. Prussian police science is economic policy, and it's a bad idea. Policy is a bad idea on a number of grounds. I mean, we can I go through all of them. For one thing, you have to assume the government is competent to do the policy. And of course, it's notorious that governments are certainly no smarter than markets are and frequently do the wrong thing. Even the most sincere and honest government you can imagine, a sort of Sweden squared, would still make a great many mistakes because, and this is a rather deeper economic point, we can't know the future. The premise of economic and social engineering is that we can know the future, that we can lay it down. Comte, Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology, early 19th century Frenchman, spoke of understand in order to predict, predict in order to control. That was his line of argument. And then you can do social engineering. But you can't predict. When the late Queen Elizabeth went to the London School of Economics after the 2008 economic collapse, she, in a sort of peevishly said to the economists there, why didn't you predict this? And the economists were embarrassed because most of them believe they can predict the economy. They fail repeatedly, but they keep thinking they can. I remember when I was a graduate student, we thought we were going to go down to Washington, this was in the 60s, and fine-tune the economy. That was the expression. And it's truly a fool's errand to think you can predict an economy. On a number of grounds. And one thing, it just hasn't worked very well. I'm people at cocktail parties, I tell them I'm an economist, and if they don't just stop talking to me entirely, which often happens, they ask me what's going to happen to interest rates. And I say to them, look, if I knew what was going to happen to interest rates, I would own a Caribbean island. I would have unlimited income because I could get a second, third, fourth mortgage on my condo and go rob some banks and put that into it and make an incredible fortune. If we knew the future history of technology, we could make unlimited fortunes. If we knew the history of the future course of economics scholarship, we could make ourselves, have a Nobel Prize. If we knew the future of mathematics, we could become great mathematicians. So there's something intrinsically crazy about thinking that for this kind of activity, namely the evolution, what the Austrian term of art, of course, is discovery. The discovery can't be predicted. If you could predict discovery, it wouldn't be discovery. You would already know it. So there's a sense in which it's just simply impossible. I came across a paper a few months ago. Someone recommended it, an astonishing paper by essentially what you'd have to call a mathematical biologist, a mathematician interested in biology. And he proved the way mathematicians prove things, that that technological evolution is like biological evolution in being completely unpredictable. All you can know about the future of technology or the future of species is that if the technology or the new species is bad, it's not going to survive. That's all you know. You don't know whether, I don't know, cows are going to evolve to have wings or something. You can't know that intrinsically. And the same is true of technology as of biology. So that's one problem. That's the kind of scientific problem. It's the Austrian economics problem. A person very good on these matters is Israel Kirzner. And it's from Israel that I was emboldened to come to believe that what's novel about the modern world is not better investment, more smooth investment, or a higher savings rate, or coal, or whatever, or trade. What's unusual about the modern world is innovation, discovery, and the circumstances of discovery. We know that having a free society is much better for discovery than having a centrally planned authoritarian society. And we know that it's a bad idea to shoot people with eyeglasses and so forth. There's sort of rough things we know about what's a good way to have a creative society, creative economy. And he says, and he's right, that the modern world was made this way. This is something I've tried to prove as an economic historian. So from the scientific point of view, if you want to put it this way, policy is impossible. Now, of course, there's another string to this bow, which is that its governments are corrupt, almost by definition corrupt. Lord Acton said, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's right. That's the whole message, really, of the public choice school, which overlaps with Austrian economics in a lot of ways. And it's that government bureaucrats and economists advising them and so on, and the prince, all have their own interests, and they may, they're not saints. And again, with this audience, I don't need to pursue that very far, because anyone who opens the newspaper knows that nations and policymakers are not saints. Okay, those are the two scientific problems, as it were. Then there's a larger, and here I'm going to stop and let's have a discussion if that's satisfactory for you. Is that okay with me if we sort of have Q&A and so forth?
Absolutely.
Yeah, good. The one other point I make in the paper is an ethical point, and it's rather obvious. It's just unethical to try to run other people's lives. It's not liberal. You could put it that way. You can also put it in Christian terms, that or Jewish or Buddhist or lots of other terms, that it's not God's wish that her creation be governed by other humans. This analogy between God's lordship over us and human to human lordship is a non sequitur and is unethical and is dangerous, and it has been a really lousy idea. That God, you can take the Christian view. I'm a Christian, I'm an Anglican or an Episcopalian, we say in the United States. And I take the view that, as I said this morning in church, I believe in God the Father, and so on and so forth. And I believe that she actually created the universe, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't imply that my neighbor should be telling me what to do, or that if I get paid by my neighbor and she tells me what to do, and it's voluntary, of course, but if she just comes over and takes out a gun and says, go do this, that's not how we should be running our lives. So there's, I think, a deep ethical problem with policy right at the beginning. So I say it's spinach, and I say to hell with it. I say we should just um, greatly reduce, or how can I, maybe a more moderate way of saying it, which is more practical, I think, is to embarrass people a little bit, make them a little bit ashamed or worried that they're proposing another way of dominating their neighbors. And still another policy. Let's have a policy of tobacco allotments, and let's have a policy about windmills, and let's have a policy about this and that, and policy at the border. Of course, a lot of us in this conversation would want the border to go away entirely and not have a border, but that let's not frighten the horses by saying that. But policies piled on policies have been a real disaster. Let me end on my favorite example, or at least a prominent and obvious example of how policy is impossible and silly and dangerous and unethical. And that is the situation of American medical care, which is one government-sponsored monopoly on top of another. The doctors, the nurses, the hospitals, the drug companies with their patents, the pharmacists down at your local corner, the insurance companies, they're all protected by the state to screw you. My favorite obvious example is the current talk about controlling drug prices. And the Dems say we want to control drug prices by giving Medicare the congressional authority to bargain with the drug companies. And the GOP says, no, we don't want to do that. Of course, the Republican Party has gone completely insane, but let's imagine the old Republican Party. They'd say, no, we love the drug companies. We want them to make more money. And so we could lower drug prices in the United States by 80% tomorrow afternoon if Congress would eliminate the prohibition of Americans buying drugs in Canada or Mexico. Tomorrow, the prices would fall enormously. So it's the monopolies piled on monopolies that make American healthcare. In some ways, it's very good. I've been the beneficiary of it, 2 hip operations and so forth. I always thank young people because they're paying for my hip operations. Thank you, dear. I've enjoyed my hip operations, compliments of your taxes. But it's not a good idea to pile one monopoly on top of another. So that's my anti-policy rant. Economic, philosophical, even religious.
Absolutely. Time for some Q&A. Does that sound good to you?
Sure, let's do it.
All right. So we have there's a primary question here, but then there's some other secondary questions, and there's a whole introduction to it. So I'm just gonna read it off. If that's okay.
Let's hear it.
All right. Deirdre, I just want to say that I love you and I adore you. I wish you all the best. This is a rare opportunity for me as I am your biggest fan. In the spirit of Wayne Booth, I want to say thank you.
Send money.
In the spirit of Wayne Booth, I want to say thank you for showing me good reasons to change my mind. You have opened the door for me to a deeper sense of meaning within the world of economics, and it is the reason why I'm here. You have forever turned me into a fan of Michael Poliani. I always desired to be able to describe the economy as well as Bastiat, but in the sense of economics, I consider you my second best alternative. And then
that's wonderful. What a compliment.
Yeah, he's your biggest fan. He's your biggest fan.
I'm glad to hear that.
And so the primary question here is there's a lot of work to be done in the field of economics, and since the only salvageable department right now is the history department, do you have any resources one should study to get started in that field?
What do you mean, resources personally?
Resources personally. Just any kind of
Well,
resources, I suppose.
well, if he or she is asking what to do to intellectually, I got lots of ideas, and so do. I mean, for example, um, there's a tremendous amount to be done in economic history, straightening out the very large number of myths that people carry around in their heads about the history of the economy that justify statism. Um, uh, uh, the well, for example, the myths that trade and profit making and so-called capitalism, a word I don't care for very much, are novel, are just products of the last few centuries. And that's just crazy. That's the other Polanyi. The the it's a man, isn't it, who's asking this question?
Hmm.
It's a he, yeah. Um, he mentions Polanyi, he means Michael Polanyi.
Hmm.
But Karl Polanyi, his not so smart brother, um, um, it has this theme that he, as a convinced socialist, he had all his life, that there's something very new about economic behavior, about markets in particular. And Michael didn't have that view as a chemist. There's a lot of intellectual work to be done. As to employment opportunities, well, I'm not an expert on that, but it depends on how old this person is. If you're young, you can come and you can come to Cato and be an intern at Cato, and that'll be fun. And or you can just go to graduate school. I, the way I'd advise doing it is go to graduate school and learn economics, and then do history. That's what I did.
Absolutely.
But I'd be glad to talk to this person by email. So um, then we could have a more, I don't know, detailed conversation about this.
Absolutely. Next question here is, how do we persuade others that mathematical existence theorems are meaningless, no better than pedantic arguments over irrelevant chess problems, and lift up the economics profession to its true standing as a literary profession?
Well, that's my theme for the last 40 years, 30 certainly. Yeah, it's how to do it. If the person asking the question can give me any hints, I'd be very pleased to have them. I've been trying to do that, and so have some other people like Arjo Klammer, the great Dutch economist, and then people like Albert Hirschman or Kenneth Boulding, great economists in the past. Adam Smith, of course. They all tried to do what you might call humanomics. That's a word that Bart Wilson at Chapman University invented, humanomics. And Vernon Smith, the great economist, and Bart did a book a couple of years ago called Humanomics. And I did a book last year called Humanomics. And we're all about not throwing away numbers, but not thinking you can solve great social problems on a blackboard, which is what blackboard economics, that's a phrase that I used and Ronald Coase quite independently used. Blackboard economics is not how to do a science. You can't understand the formation of galaxies as an astrophysicist or a cosmologist just by sheer thought. You can't prove the existence of galaxies. You've got to go look at them and scale your arguments to the appropriate magnitudes, and then say, well, if there's this much matter and this much dark matter, it's going to go this way or that. So the great tool, the great quantitative tool in empirical studies, and this includes studies of romantic poetry as much as studies of galaxies or studies of the economy, is simulation, is getting down into the 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 mechanisms and asking how big they are. How much of a constraint are rhyme schemes on the way poetry works? For example, this is a kind of strange example, but you can think of lots of. It's not true that the humanities are a completely separate enterprise to, to physics. they're they're they have a great deal of overlap in how to do them. But how to persuade people, it's really hard because they're fixed on a sort of naive positivism. We got another book that I published a couple of years ago or a year or so ago, which is an attack on neo-institutionalism and positivism as mechanical versions of science. So in short, I don't know. If I knew, I'd be rich.
Wouldn't we all? Another question here is, do you have any sons or daughters of Kuhn that you would recommend reading?
Yeah, I have a number of them. One is I've been having some very interesting relations with him the last few months. Harry Collins, who's now has been for a long time at what's the capital of Wales? Cardiff, at, at the University of Cardiff, and he's a terrific sociologist of science. There are lots of very good historians of science. The guys at Cambridge, I'm trying to remember their names. But I sort of got in with these people way back in the early 80s. Harry Collins was visiting Princeton in I guess the sociology department. He's a sociologist. The same time I was at the Institute for Advanced Study outside of Princeton. And I got to know Harry then. I think it was 82 or something like that, 1982. And then I got into the history and sociology of science. Philosophers of science are less recommendable, as they tend to want to, most of them, except Paul Feyerabend and a few others, tend to want to run a little machine of advice for scientists. And I'm against that.
All right. And next question here is, what do you think is the meaning behind a Jackson Pollock painting?
Well, it depends on which age of Jackson Pollock. His early paintings, where he was splattering stuff, well, first he just did pictures, but then he started the splatter stuff. He'd have a big piece of canvas on the floor and he'd throw paint at it. And the early splatter paintings are no good. I think everyone agrees. And then, remarkably, he got to be good at splattering paint. And late Pollocks are just wonderful. You can't take your eyes off them. They're just so good. There's a je ne sais quoi about great art or great thoughts or great ethical principles or great poetry or great music. I'm just now in an old age, I'm getting into classical music in a more serious way than I ever have been. And there's just something about the Flute and Harp Concerto by Mozart. I play it every morning. I ask my assistant, Alexa, I say, Alexa, play the Flute and Harp Concerto by Mozart. If I say Mozart's Flute and Harp Concerto, she can't understand it, so I have to do it the other way around. I don't know if that's responsive. Do you think I need to say more?
I think that works.
Yeah.
Next question here is, what are some newer scholars that you believe are worthy of attention and will get big sooner or later?
Well, big schmig. Um, our field of economics, and this applies to the subfield of Austrian economics and lots and everywhere, is so fashion driven that
Hmm.
what's big doesn't interest me a great deal. I mean, there's a kind of careerism that I don't admire, which is how do you make your subject big? This is one of my quarrels I have with my dear friend Pete 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 Bodke. Pete is always talking, trying to make Austrian economics successful scientifically. Now, of course, Pete really means successful scientifically as science, but he keeps slipping into talking about it in careerist terms. How can we? And I can understand it. He's running a Austrian economics program. He wants his kids to get jobs. I get it. I understand. But we can't do real science that way, or real art, or real music, or real anything, real sports. You know, if you're gonna be Pele, you got to be Pele. You got to just do it. And whether Pele becomes famous or not is not something that Pele, as an artistic soccer player, should care about.
Next question
So I
here.
suppose I suppose I'm just blowing off the question, and I understand. I have the here in my life. I've had the advantage that I believed in everything I advocated, but I kept advocating different things. I started out as a socialist when I was a teenager, and then became at Harvard College as Keynesian because that was what was on offer, and I believed that. And then a kind of social engineer, the kind of was saying is impossible a few minutes ago. Then I became a Chicago economist, and I said, "Oh yeah, Chicago, yeah, separation of fact and value, yeah, boy, that's how to do it." And so then I got into humanism and said, "Yeah, this is it. This was in the '80s." And then I got into Austrian economics mainly because of Don Lavoie and the other uh, um, uh, um, the other Austrian economists. And then I'm into Christian economics, and I believe that. So it's because I'm such a fool and keep running from one position to another, but believing them all, that my career has been okay. Because I started as a conventional economist and got tenure at the University of Chicago as a conventional economist. And so I understand people worrying about their career. On the other hand, it seems to me that if a young Austrian economics scholar, if she does excellent scientific work, does surveys or looks at statistical facts or really thinks through phenomenon in the economic world in a deeply serious way, the way my friend Steve Chung, the property rights economist, used to do. She's going to do good scientific work, and even people who don't understand Austrian economics or anything else will see that it's good work. Look, the best advice I've ever gotten was from my driving instructor in high school. It was aim high in steering. In steering a car, don't just look at the road just in front of you, look down the road.
Absolutely. So one last question here. I'll ask you, are you optimistic for the future of the economics profession?
Uh, Look, I'm an optimist. You don't change gender unless you're an optimist. Uh, you don't have this mad career I've had unless you're something of an optimist. But I must say, economists keep wandering off into silly fashions. The fashions for big data now, the fashion for economists doing sociology. This I blame on the on the Freakonomics
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, they do sociology without knowing anything about sociology or society for that matter. I mean, that's disgraceful. If you're going to do sociology, you ought to read Simmel and Weber, and you ought to read sociology. You ought to know what you're talking about. They don't. They just say, oh, here's a Freakonomics peculiarity that we can look into, and oh, hey, we can do big data and then do econometrics incompetently. Because all modern econometrics, unfortunately, depends on tests of statistical significance. And the American Statistical Association some years ago did an official report admitting that tests of statistical significance are nonsense. And yet this hasn't gotten through. So, I've seen a lot of fashions come and go in economics. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, the big fashion was activity analysis, which you've never heard of. But it means generalizing linear programming, which you probably all haven't heard of either. Maybe linear programming is very good for petroleum refiners. It's a good thing to know because catalytic cracking takes the raw oil and makes it into different things in fixed proportions. You get so much gasoline, so much jet fuel, so much this, so much that. That's the thing. And there, Solow and Samuelson and my teacher Bob Dorfman wrote a famous book in 1958, I think it was. And everyone was at Harvard and MIT was going to do activity analysis. And so I learned it, and in 5 years it was dead. Game theory is dying. So I don't know. There's an awful lot of foolishness in the scientific world. But that's true of every science. We shouldn't feel ashamed. If scientists always made the right decision of what to study and always were working down the right line to get to the right point, all sciences, historical, humanistic, physical, would progress social at the speed of light. They would just be better and better. Every day they'd get better and better and better. But there are dead ends in all the sciences. It happens all the time. By the way, the word science I'm using in the German or Chinese or Turkish way, which is the way it was used in English before the middle of the 19th century, namely systematic inquiry. So Wissenschaft in German, you can have klassische Wissenschaft or Geisteswissenschaft, which is the German word for the humanities. Spirit science is what it means in English.
All right.
So science is not perfect, so don't lose faith. Keep working. Coraggio.
Absolutely. Well, with that being said, thank you very much for being here, Dr. McCloskey. We appreciate it very much.
Don't call me doctor. That'll be doctor. I'll charge you more.
My apologies. Thank you very much for being here, Deidre. Appreciate it very much.
Okay,
Do you have anything you want to promote or plug before we let you go here?
well, I want you to buy my books. Read, but you can read them, but that's optional. Do buy them.
They look very nice just on a bookshelf, so.
That's right. They look very nice, big, thick volumes. I've finally gone back to doing short volumes, but anyway, there you are.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Okie doke. Cheerio. Be good. If you can't be good, be careful.
Sage advice. Thank you.
Yeah. Cheerio. Let me figure out how to close this. I don't know how to do it.
All right. Well, with that being said, I want to thank you very much for everybody for being here for day 2 of the Austrian Economics Discord Conference. I apologize for all the technical difficulties and everything we had earlier. Appreciate it very much. Thank you all. Hope you had a great conference. The recordings for all these presentations and everything are going to be posted eventually. There's going to be an announcement whenever that happens. So they'll be posted over the next couple weeks or so. The YouTube recording, the live stream you're watching right now, will be available immediately. So if you just want to go back and watch that, you can do that as well. But with that being said, thank everybody very much. We appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your day.